The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Michael stood in front of Simpson's corner store, clutching his shopping bag filled with freshly bought school supplies. The 14-year-old had just used his birthday money to buy new notebooks, pencils, and his favorite mechanical pencils, the ones with the special grip his teachers always complimented him on for his neat handwriting. He checked his phone again, reading his mom's text. "Running 10 minutes late, honey. Traffic on Main Street. Stay where I can see you." Michael shifted his weight from one foot to the other, adjusting his blue polo shirt, the one his grandmother had given him for getting straight A's last semester. The store's security camera blinked silently above him, its red light a steady presence as he waited. Inside his bag, the receipt was neatly folded and tucked into one of the notebooks. Michael was always organized, something his parents had taught him from an early age. "Keep your receipts, keep your records," his dad would always say. "It's just good practice." The peaceful afternoon suddenly shifted when a police cruiser pulled up sharply to the curb, its tires making a soft screeching sound against the asphalt. Two officers stepped out, their hands already resting on their belts. Michael's heart skipped a beat, but he reminded himself of what his parents had always told him: stay calm, be polite, and remember your rights. "Hey, you there, don't move." The first officer's voice boomed across the short distance. Officer Taylor, as his nameplate read, approached with quick steps, his partner following close behind. Michael's hands began to tremble slightly, but he kept them visible, just as his parents had taught him. "Sir, is there a problem?" Michael's voice came out steady, despite his racing heart. He could feel the cool brick wall of the store against his back as the officers closed in. "We got a report of shoplifting. Blue shirt, young male, matches your description perfectly," Officer Taylor said, his voice tight with accusation. His partner, Officer Rodriguez, was already reaching for Michael's shopping bag. "Sir, I have a receipt," Michael said, keeping his voice level. "It's in my notebook. I can show you." "Hands where we can see them." Officer Rodriguez cut him off, interpreting Michael's slight movement toward his bag as suspicious. The situation was escalating faster than Michael could process. "But sir, Michael tried again, his voice cracking slightly. The fear was starting to set in, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he knew how quickly these situations could go wrong despite innocence. "Against the wall now," Officer Taylor commanded, stepping forward. Michael complied, his heart pounding in his ears. The rough brick scraped against his palms as he was patted down, the indignity of the situation burning in his chest. Other customers were starting to gather at the store's windows, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. Mr. Patel, the store owner, came rushing out, waving his hands. "Officers, officers, this boy just bought supplies. I have the camera footage." But Mr. Patel's protests went unheard as the officers already had Michael in handcuffs, the cold metal biting into his wrists. "We'll sort this out at the station," Officer Taylor said firmly, leading Michael toward the police car. The shopping bag with his supplies lay forgotten on the sidewalk, the receipt still tucked safely inside, an ignored piece of evidence that could have prevented everything that was about to unfold. As Michael was placed in the back of the police car, he caught a glimpse of Mr. Patel frantically dialing a phone number and several bystanders recording with their phones. His own phone buzzed in his pocket, probably his mom wondering where he was. The police car's door slammed shut, and Michael watched through the window as his familiar neighborhood transformed into a blur of buildings and trees. He thought about his father, a respected civil rights attorney, and his mother, who always taught him to hold his head high no matter what. They had prepared him for moments like this, but experiencing it firsthand was entirely different. As the car turned toward the police station, Michael closed his eyes and took deep breaths, knowing that soon, very soon, things would change. His father would make sure of that. The late afternoon sun continued to shine through the police car's windows, casting alternating patterns of light and shadow across Michael's face as they drove. He remained silent, remembering every detail, every word spoken, every procedure ignored. His father had always said that observation was the key to justice, and right now, Michael was observing everything. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Michael sat in a hard plastic chair, his hands still cuffed behind his back. The handcuffs were too tight, but he remembered his father's words: "Stay calm, Stay focused, and remember, everything they do and say matters. Officer Taylor was typing something into a computer, the clicking of keys echoing through the quiet room. Officer Rodriguez stood nearby, flipping through a small notepad. Neither of them had read Michael his rights. Another detail he carefully noted in his mental record of events. "Please," Michael said quietly, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I need to call my parents. It's my right to make a phone call." Officer Taylor barely glanced up from his computer. "We'll get to that. First, we need to process you." The clock on the wall ticked loudly, 4:45 p.m. Michael's mom would be frantic by now. His phone had been taken away and placed in a clear plastic bag on a nearby desk, its screen occasionally lighting up with incoming messages he couldn't read. "I didn't steal anything," Michael tried again. "Mr. Patel, the store owner, he can confirm." "Listen, kid," Officer Rodriguez cut in, closing his notepad with a snap. "We've heard every excuse in the book. Just make this easier on yourself and—" The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Through the glass partition, Michael could see other officers suddenly standing straighter, adjusting their uniforms. Then he heard it, a familiar voice that made him sit up straighter. "My son was detained without cause, without being read his rights, and denied his phone call." The voice grew closer, authoritative and controlled. "I want to see him immediately." Michael's father stepped into view, impeccable in his charcoal gray suit despite having clearly rushed from court. His leather briefcase was clutched in one hand and his phone was recording video in the other. The change in the room's atmosphere was instant and palpable. Officer Taylor stood up quickly, his chair rolling backward. "Sir, you can't just—" "I'm Christopher Wilson of Wilson and Associates Law Firm," Michael's father interrupted, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made everyone in the room take notice. "And you have my 14-year-old son in custody without cause or proper procedure." Officer Rodriguez stepped forward, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Wilson, we're investigating a shoplifting incident." "Are you?" Christopher raised an eyebrow, pulling out his tablet. "Because I have here a security footage screenshot from Mr. Patel's store showing my son making a purchase." He turned the screen around, showing the clear image of Michael at the counter, receipt in hand. "I also have Mr. Patel on record stating he tried to inform you of this at the scene." The officers exchanged glances. The room had grown very quiet except for the continued buzzing of the fluorescent lights. "Furthermore," Christopher continued, his voice growing firmer, "I have witness statements from 3 bystanders who recorded the entire interaction. Would you like to explain why my son wasn't read his rights? Or why he was denied his phone call? Or perhaps why he's still in handcuffs despite there being zero evidence of any crime?" Officer Taylor's face had gone pale. Officer Rodriguez was suddenly very interested in his shoes. Through the glass partition, Michael could see other officers gathering, watching the scene unfold. "Remove those handcuffs from my son. Now." Christopher's voice left no room for argument. As Officer Rodriguez hurried to comply, Michael felt the pressure on his wrists release. He brought his hands forward slowly, rubbing the red marks where the cuffs had been too tight. His father's eyes narrowed at the sight of the marks, and he took several photos with his phone. "Michael," his father said softly, "are you okay?" "Yes, Dad," Michael replied, standing up straight despite his shaking legs. "I remember everything, just like you taught me." Christopher placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, but his eyes remained fixed on the officers. "This isn't over, gentlemen. Not by a long shot. But right now, I'm taking my son home. You can expect to hear from our office tomorrow morning." As they walked toward the exit, Michael noticed how other officers moved out of their way, their faces a mix of embarrassment and concern. His father's hand remained steady on his shoulder, a reminder that he wasn't alone, that justice would be served. Just before they reached the door, Christopher turned back. "Oh, and officers? The next time you decide to arrest someone without cause, you might want to check if their father is the attorney who just won the Thompson police misconduct case last month. Just a thought." The ride home was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Michael knew his father was giving him space to process everything. As they pulled into their driveway, Christopher turned to his son. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. "You kept your cool, you remembered your rights, and you stayed strong. But I'm so sorry you had to go through that." Michael nodded, feeling tears finally threatening to fall. Dad, what happens now? His father's expression was determined but calm. Now? Now we make sure this never happens to another kid in this town again. Ready to help me make some real change? Michael straightened up in his seat, wiping his eyes. Ready, Dad. Let's do it. The morning after Michael's wrongful arrest, the Wilson family's kitchen was filled with quiet determination. Michael's mother, Lisa, a community organizer herself, was already making calls while preparing breakfast. The smell of coffee and toast filled the air as Michael came downstairs, still processing the events of yesterday. How did you sleep, honey? Lisa asked, pulling him into a tight hug. Her eyes were tired. She'd probably been up most of the night worried about him. Okay, I guess, Michael replied, settling into a kitchen chair. The local morning news played quietly on the small TV in the corner. Dad already left for work. He's in his home office, Lisa said, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him. He's been on calls since 6 a.m. The police chief wants to meet with us today. As if on cue, Christopher walked into the kitchen, his phone pressed to his ear. Yes, Chief Thompson, we can be there at 10. But I want the body camera footage ready for review. He paused, listening. And yes, both officers should be present. Michael pushed his eggs around his plate, remembering the fear and humiliation of the previous day. His mom noticed and squeezed his shoulder gently. You don't have to come to the meeting if you don't want to, she said softly. But your dad thinks it might be important for them to see you, to see that you're not just a case number, but a real person they hurt. Michael straightened up in his chair. I want to go, he said firmly. I want them to explain why they did what they did. 2 hours later, Michael sat between his parents in Police Chief Thompson's office. The room was tense, with Officers Taylor and Rodriguez standing uncomfortably near the wall, while the chief sat behind his large desk, looking genuinely troubled. First, Chief Thompson began, I want to apologize to you, Michael. What happened yesterday was unacceptable. He turned to Christopher and Lisa, and to you both as parents. This isn't how our officers are trained to handle situations. With all due respect, Chief, Christopher replied, his voice measured but firm. Apologies aren't enough. We've reviewed the body camera footage this morning. The officers' actions show a clear pattern of bias and misconduct. The footage played on a large screen mounted on the wall. Michael watched himself on screen, calm and cooperative, while the officers grew increasingly aggressive without cause. His father had been right. Seeing it played back made everything even more obviously wrong. Officers, Chief Thompson turned to Taylor and Rodriguez. Would either of you care to explain your actions? Officer Taylor stepped forward, his face red. Sir, we were responding to a shoplifting call. A call? Christopher interrupted. That described a suspect wearing a red hoodie, not a blue polo shirt. A suspect who had run away from the store, not one standing calmly outside with a shopping bag and receipt. Officer Rodriguez looked at Michael for the first time since entering the room. We made a mistake, he said quietly. We should have checked the receipt. We should have listened to the store owner. A mistake? Lisa leaned forward, her voice trembling with controlled anger. A mistake is getting someone's order wrong at a restaurant. This was a violation of my son's civil rights. This was racial profiling. The room fell silent. Michael watched as Chief Thompson removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes tiredly. You're absolutely right, Mrs. Wilson, he said finally. And this ends today. Both officers will be placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. He turned to Michael. Young man, would you be willing to help us make some changes? Michael sat up straighter. What kind of changes? We need to rebuild trust with our community, Chief Thompson explained. Especially with our young people. Would you be interested in joining a new youth advisory council? Help us understand how to better serve and protect everyone in this community. Christopher and Lisa exchanged looks. That's Michael's decision, his father said. But any program would need to have real power to make changes, not just be for show. Absolutely, Chief Thompson agreed. The council would have direct input into our training programs, community outreach, and policy reforms. He looked at Michael. What do you think? Michael thought about all the other kids who might find themselves in similar situations, kids who might not have parents who knew their rights or how to fight back. He thought about Mr. Patel, who tried to help but was ignored. "I'll do it," Michael said firmly. "But I have conditions." Everyone in the room looked surprised, especially his parents. But Michael continued, his voice growing stronger. "First, I want regular meetings where kids can share their experiences with the police, good and bad. Second, I want officers to spend time in our schools, not just as security, but actually getting to know us as people. And third," he looked directly at Officers Taylor and Rodriguez, "I want every officer to go through new training about how to talk to young people, how to listen to us." Chief Thompson looked impressed. Christopher was beaming with pride. Even the two officers seemed moved by Michael's words. "Those are excellent suggestions," Chief Thompson said, making notes. "In fact, I'd like to start implementing them right away." He looked at the two officers. "And I think I know who our first volunteers for the new training program will be." As they left the police station that day, Michael felt different. The fear and anger from yesterday was still there, but now they were mixed with something else. Hope. Hope that something good could come from what happened to him. "You did good in there, son," Christopher said as they walked to the car. "Really good." "Thanks, Dad," Michael replied, then grinned slightly. "Think I might have a future in law." His parents laughed, and for the first time since yesterday, everything felt like it might be okay. Not just okay, but better. Because sometimes, Michael realized, it takes one person standing up to make real change happen. 2 weeks after the incident, Michael stood nervously in front of the community center's main hall. The room was packed with people, students, parents, teachers, police officers, and community members. Posters announcing the Youth and Law Enforcement Bridge Building Initiative hung on the walls. "Ready?" his mother whispered, straightening his collar. Michael nodded, clutching his note cards. He'd been preparing for this moment, but seeing all those faces looking up at him made his heart race. Chief Thompson stepped up to the podium first. "Good evening, everyone. We're here today because a young man in our community experienced something that should never have happened. But instead of letting anger divide us, he chose to help us build bridges." Michael watched as people in the audience nodded. He spotted Mr. Patel from the store sitting near the front, giving him a thumbs up. Officer Rodriguez and Officer Taylor sat in their civilian clothes, looking both uncomfortable and attentive. "Now, I'd like to introduce Michael Wilson, the chairman of our new Youth Advisory Council." The applause felt warm and encouraging as Michael approached the podium. His note cards trembled slightly in his hands, but his voice came out clear and strong. 2 weeks ago, I was wrongfully arrested outside Simpson's corner store," he began. "I was scared. I was angry. But mostly, I was disappointed. Disappointed that in our community, someone could be treated differently just because of how they look." The room was silent now, everyone hanging on his words. But today isn't about dwelling on what went wrong. It's about making things right. Michael looked around the room, making eye contact with different faces. In the past 2 weeks, something amazing has happened. Police officers have been coming to our schools, not to patrol, but to talk, to listen, to play basketball with us during lunch breaks, to help with homework after school. He gestured to a group of officers in the back who had been part of the new initiative. They smiled and waved. Officer Rodriguez and Officer Taylor, Michael continued, looking at them directly, made a mistake that day. But they've also shown real courage in admitting it and working to change. They've been leading discussions in our school about rights, responsibilities, and mutual respect. The two officers sat up straighter, looking surprised at the acknowledgement. "Today, we're launching 3 new programs," Michael announced, his confidence growing. First, the Know Your Rights workshops, where both youth and police officers learn about legal rights and proper procedures together. Second, the Community Connection program, where officers will spend time each week in schools and youth centers, building real relationships. And third, the Youth Voice initiative, where young people like me can share our experiences and ideas directly with law enforcement leaders. The audience broke into spontaneous applause. Michael saw his father wiping away tears, trying to be discreet about it. But here's the most important part, Michael continued once the clapping died down. "This isn't just about police and young people, it's about all of us. Every person in this room has a role to play in making our community stronger and safer." He pulled out a small receipt from his pocket, the same one from the store that day. This receipt might seem like just a piece of paper, but it represents something bigger. It represents the truth that wasn't listened to, the voice that wasn't heard. But it also represents change, because sometimes the smallest things can lead to the biggest transformations. As Michael stepped back from the podium, the applause was thunderous. People stood up, cheering and wiping away tears. But what happened next wasn't part of the planned program. Officer Rodriguez stood up and walked to the podium. "Can I say something?" he asked quietly. Chief Thompson nodded, and the room fell silent again. "Michael," Officer Rodriguez began, his voice thick with emotion, "that day, I forgot the most important part of my job, to protect and serve everyone in this community. I forgot to see you as someone's son, someone's student, someone's friend. I made assumptions that I never should have made." He turned to face the audience. But this young man, who had every right to be angry, chose to teach us instead. He showed us a better way forward. And I promise you, Michael, and everyone here, that I will spend every day of my career living up to the example you've set. Suddenly, Mr. Patel stood up. "I want to help too. My store will be a safe space for young people. Any student who needs help or feels unsafe can come in. I will always listen. I will always help." One by one, people started standing up, offering their own commitments to change. A teacher volunteered to host after-school discussions. A retired judge offered to lead legal education workshops. Even the local newspaper editor promised to cover youth perspectives more thoroughly. Michael stood there, amazed at how one difficult moment had transformed into something so powerful. His mother squeezed his hand, and his father put an arm around his shoulders. "See what you started," his father whispered proudly. "We started," Michael corrected him, watching as more people stood up to make their own pledges. All of us together. As the evening continued, Michael realized that this wasn't just about fixing what had gone wrong that day at the store. It was about building something new, something better. It was about turning a moment of injustice into a movement for change. And looking around the room, seeing police officers chatting with students, watching community members exchanging phone numbers and making plans, Michael knew that this was just the beginning. 3 months after the community center meeting, the changes in town were visible everywhere you looked. The local coffee shop had become an unofficial hangout spot where police officers and teenagers could often be seen chatting over hot chocolate and cookies. The park that once emptied when patrol cars drove by was now hosting weekly basketball games between cops and kids. Michael sat at his usual table in Simpson's corner store, helping a group of younger students with their math homework. The store had transformed too. Mr. Patel had set up a small study area with free Wi-Fi and snacks for students. Officers would often stop by, not to patrol, but to join the tutoring sessions. "Hey, Michael," Mr. Patel called out, waving from behind the counter. "Officer Rodriguez is here with the new pamphlets for the rights workshop." Officer Rodriguez, now a regular friendly face in the community, walked in carrying a box of colorful brushes. He looked different these days, more relaxed, more approachable. The stiff, intimidating officer from 3 months ago had been replaced by someone who high-fived kids and knew everyone's names. "How's the math going?" Rodriguez asked, pulling up a chair. One of the younger kids, Tommy, immediately showed him a particularly tricky problem. "City? This is why I became a police officer, not a mathematician," Rodriguez laughed, scratching his head at the algebra equation. The bell above the door chimed as Chief Thompson walked in, followed by Michael's father. They'd been meeting regularly, working on new policies and training programs. The changes weren't just surface level, they were becoming part of the department's DNA. "Michael, got a minute?" his father called. "We've got some news we'd like to share." The small study group gathered around as more people filtered into the store. Mr. Patel started handing out his famous homemade cookies, the ones that had become a symbol of community meetings. "The City Council just approved our new training program," Chief Thompson announced, beaming with pride. "Starting next month, every officer in the department will go through youth interaction training, designed with input from our Youth Advisory Council." Michael felt a surge of pride. The council, which had started with just him and a few friends, now had 20 active members from different schools across town. They met weekly, sharing ideas and concerns directly with police leadership. "But that's not all," his father added, pulling out some papers. Remember those body camera videos from that day? He didn't need to specify which day, everyone knew. Well, they're now part of the training program at the police academy. Your story, Michael, is helping future officers learn what not to do. Tommy raised his hand shyly. Is that why Officer Taylor came to our school yesterday to say sorry? Officer Rodriguez nodded. Taylor's been doing a lot of thinking. He's requested to be transferred to the School Resource Officer program, wants to learn how to better connect with young people. The store was getting crowded now. Parents stopping by after work, other officers dropping in, even the mayor poked her head in to see what was happening. Mr. Patel's store had become more than just a corner shop, it was the heart of community change. You know what the best part is? Chief Thompson continued, looking around the room. Complaints against officers are down 60% since we started these programs. Trust is being rebuilt, one conversation at a time. Michael watched as Officer Rodriguez helped Tommy with another math problem, while Mr. Patel passed around more cookies. His father was showing some community members the new training materials, and his mother, who had just arrived, was already organizing the next youth council meeting on her tablet. Oh, and Michael, Chief Thompson added, the State Police Academy called. They want you to come speak at their graduation ceremony next month. They think your story could help shape the next generation of officers. The room erupted in cheers and congratulations. Michael felt overwhelmed, but in a good way. He remembered standing in front of this same store 3 months ago, terrified and alone. Now, looking around at all these faces, officers, students, neighbors, friends, he saw something beautiful, a community coming together. You know what's funny? Michael said, once the excitement died down a bit. That receipt I kept from that day? I framed it. Mom thought I was crazy, but I wanted to remember. Remember what? Tommy asked, looking up from his math homework. That sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes, Michael replied. That one piece of paper meant nothing to those officers that day, but it sparked all of this. Officer Rodriguez stood up, clearing his throat. Speaking of changes, he said, pulling something from his pocket. It was a small card. We're introducing these now. Every officer has to give one to any young person they stop. It has their name, badge number, and a direct line to file complaints or compliments. Transparency and accountability, just like you asked for, Michael. The afternoon sun streamed through the store windows, casting warm light on the diverse group of people who had become an unlikely but powerful community. Outside, kids rode their bikes past patrol cars without fear. Officers walked their beats, stopping to chat with residents instead of just watching them. Mr. Patel suddenly clapped his hands. Okay, everyone, new batch of cookies coming out. And Michael, your mother tells me you got an A on your history test. As the conversation shifted to everyday topics, homework, cookies, weekend plans, Michael caught his father's eye across the room. They shared a knowing look. This was what justice looked like. Not just in courtrooms or police stations, but right here in a corner store turned community center where officers helped with math homework and kids grew up feeling protected instead of afraid. 6 months after the incident, Michael stood nervously backstage at the State Police Academy's graduation ceremony. Through the curtain, he could see hundreds of soon-to-be officers in their dress uniforms, along with their families and friends filling the auditorium. You okay? His mother asked, straightening his tie for the 10th time. She couldn't help fussing. It was her way of dealing with nervous energy. Yeah, there are so many of them, Michael replied, peeking through the curtain again. He spotted Officer Rodriguez and Officer Taylor sitting in the front row, both now serving as trainers for the Academy's new community engagement program. Remember, his father said, putting a hand on his shoulder, they're here to learn from you. Your story has already changed one town. Now it's going to help change many more. The Academy superintendent approached the podium. Today, before we present the badges to our graduating class, we have a special guest. His story has become a catalyst for change in police training across our state. Please welcome Michael Wilson. The applause was polite but curious as Michael walked to the podium. He looked out at the sea of faces, young officers at the start of their careers, ready to learn and grow. 6 months ago, Michael began, his voice steady. I was wrongfully arrested outside a corner store. I was just a kid buying school supplies, but to 2 officers that day, I was automatically a suspect. The room was completely silent now. I could stand here and tell you about the fear I felt, about the anger and disappointment, but instead, I want to tell you about what happened next, because that's the part that matters most. Michael clicked a button, and photos appeared on the large screen behind him. Images of the youth council meetings, the basketball games in the park, the study sessions at Mr. Patel's store. These pictures show what's possible when law enforcement and communities truly connect. In my town, we turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change. Officers now spend time in schools, not as guards, but as mentors. They help with homework, coach sports teams, and most importantly, they listen. He clicked to the next slide. A graph showing the dramatic drop in complaints against officers alongside rising community satisfaction ratings. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The real change is in the little moments. It's in the way kids no longer cross the street when they see a patrol car. It's in the way officers know people's names and stories. It's in the trust that grows when both sides see each other as human beings first. Michael paused, looking directly at the graduating class. Tomorrow, you'll receive your badges. You'll have power, authority, and responsibility. But remember this, your most powerful tool isn't your badge or your uniform. It's your ability to connect, to listen, and to see the humanity in every person you meet. He pulled out the familiar receipt from his pocket, now laminated and slightly worn. This receipt, the one that could have prevented everything if only those officers had taken a moment to look at it, it's become a symbol in our training programs, not just of what went wrong, but of how small actions can have huge consequences, both good and bad. The next slides showed the new initiatives spreading to other departments, the youth advisory councils, the community connection programs, the transparency cards. Officer Rodriguez and Officer Taylor, who are here today, made a mistake with me. But they also showed incredible courage in admitting that mistake and working to create change. They're now teaching other officers how to build trust instead of fear. Michael clicked to a final slide. A recent photo of a community barbecue where officers and residents shared food, stories, and laughter. This is what success looks like in law enforcement. Not in the number of arrests made or tickets written, but in the strength of bonds built. Each of you has the power to either build these bonds or break them. The choice will be yours to make every single day. He looked down at his notes, then set them aside. Last week, something amazing happened. I was helping some kids with homework at Mr. Patel's store when a call came in about a shoplifting incident nearby. The responding officers didn't just rush in with assumptions. They took time to gather facts, to listen to witnesses, to treat everyone with respect. They handled it perfectly. And one of those officers later told me they thought about my story while responding. Michael's voice grew stronger. That's why I'm here today, because each of you will face moments where you have to make quick decisions. Moments where it's easy to fall back on assumptions and biases. In those moments, I hope you'll remember this. Behind every interaction is a human being with a story, with rights, with dignity. Your job isn't just to enforce the law, it's to protect those human beings and their rights. The room erupted in applause, but Michael wasn't finished. Before I go, I want to make you an offer. In your welcome packets, you'll find my contact information. I'm part of a network of youth advocates across the state. We're ready to work with any department that wants to build stronger community connections. Because this isn't just about fixing what's broken, it's about building something better. As Michael stepped away from the podium, the applause was different now, not just polite, but passionate. Officers stood up, many wiping away tears. The superintendent returned to the microphone, visibly moved. Thank you, Michael. Your words will stay with these officers throughout their careers. And I'm proud to announce that starting next year, every police academy in our state will include community engagement training based on your town's model. Later, as officers and their families came up to talk, share stories, and ask questions, Michael felt a deep sense of purpose. His father was right. One story, told honestly and with hope, could help change not just one town, but an entire system. 1 year after the incident at Simpson's corner store, the town had transformed in ways nobody could have predicted. The local newspaper's headline read, "Community Policing Program Becomes National Model." But the real story wasn't in the headlines, it was in the everyday moments that showed how much had changed. It was a warm Saturday morning, and the park was buzzing with activity. The annual Community Unity Fair was in full swing, with booths, games, and the smell of barbecue filling the air. Michael stood at the Youth Advisory Council booth, surrounded by photos documenting the year's journey. "Remember this one?" Officer Rodriguez asked, pointing to a picture from the first community meeting. "Look how nervous everyone was, sitting on opposite sides of the room." Michael laughed. The latest meetings looked very different. Officers and residents mixed together, sharing ideas and solving problems as one community. "Hey, Michael," called Tommy, now one of the youngest members of the Youth Council. "The basketball tournament is about to start. Officers versus students." The basketball court had become a symbol of the new relationship between police and young people. Officer Taylor, now heading the School Resource Officer program, was already there, helping kids warm up. "Don't forget," Taylor called out to his team of officers, "when we lose, we're buying ice cream for everyone." "You mean if you lose?" Tommy corrected with a grin. "No, he means when." Officer Rodriguez laughed. "Have you seen these kids play?" Michael's parents watched from the sidelines as the game began. His father was talking with Chief Thompson about expanding the program to other cities, while his mother coordinated with volunteers setting up the lunch tables. Mr. Patel arrived with boxes of his famous cookies, now officially known as community cookies, and sold in stores across town. Each box had a small note sharing the story of how a corner store became the heart of positive change. "Michael," Chief Thompson called, waving him over. "Come meet these visitors." A group of police chiefs and community leaders from other cities stood nearby, taking notes and photos. They've been arriving steadily over the past few months, eager to learn how to implement similar programs in their own communities. "Tell them about the cards," Chief Thompson encouraged. Michael pulled out one of the now familiar transparency cards that officers gave out during any interaction with the public. What had started as a simple idea had evolved into a sophisticated program. The cards now included QR codes linking to officer profiles, community resources, and a feedback system that helped build trust and accountability. "But the cards are just the beginning," Michael explained to the visitors. "Real change happens in the relationships we build." As if to prove his point, the basketball game paused as everyone broke for water. Officers and kids sat together on the bleachers, laughing and chatting like old friends. Parents who once hurried their children away from police now brought them over to say hello. "A year ago," Michael continued, "I was wrongfully arrested right over there." He pointed to Simpson's corner store across the street. "I could have let that moment define me with anger. Instead, it defined our community with hope." One of the visiting chiefs spoke up. "But how do you maintain this? What happens when new officers join the force?" "That's the best part," Officer Rodriguez answered, walking over with a water bottle. "It's in our DNA now." New officers are paired with youth mentors for their first month. They learn the community by being part of it, not just policing it. The sound of laughter drew everyone's attention back to the basketball court. Officer Taylor had tried to make a fancy shot and ended up falling dramatically, making all the kids giggle. He got up with a theatrical bow, showing how comfort and trust had replaced fear and tension. "You know what's really amazing?" Michael's father added, joining the conversation. "Last month, when we had that incident at the high school." Michael remembered it well. A misunderstanding had almost escalated into a serious situation, but instead of jumping to conclusions, the responding officers had followed the new protocols, listening, gathering facts, and treating everyone with respect. A situation that could have ended badly instead became an example of how far they'd come. Speaking of amazing, his mother called out, "Look who's here." A group of state legislators walked into the park, led by the governor herself. They'd heard about the program's success and wanted to see it firsthand. But instead of heading straight for the officials, they joined the basketball game, with the governor showing off some surprisingly good moves. As the afternoon continued, Michael found a quiet moment to sit with Officer Rodriguez and Officer Taylor. They watched as the community celebrated around them, kids teaching police officers the latest dance moves, elderly residents sharing stories with young officers, teenagers explaining social media to bewildered but interested veterans. "Did you ever imagine this?" Michael asked them. "A year ago, I mean." Officer Taylor shook his head. "Never. I was so stuck in the old way of doing things, seeing everyone as potential threats instead of potential friends." You know what I love most?" Officer Rodriguez added, watching as Tommy excitedly showed a new officer around the park. "The kids don't see uniforms anymore. They just see people. And we don't see stereotypes, we see individuals." The sun was setting as the fair wound down. Families gathered for one last group photo, officers, residents, young, old, all together. As Michael looked through the camera lens, he saw more than just smiling faces. He saw proof that change was possible, that one moment of injustice could spark a movement of justice, and that sometimes the biggest transformations started with the smallest moments. "Time for community cookies," Mr. Patel announced, bringing out the last batch of the day. And as everyone gathered around, sharing cookies and stories under the evening sky, Michael realized something beautiful. They weren't just fixing what was broken, they had built something entirely new, something better than anyone had imagined possible. The receipt that had started it all was still framed in the store, but it wasn't just a reminder of what went wrong anymore. It had become a symbol of how right things could go when people chose to learn, to grow, and to see the humanity in each other.